Hello, my name is Michael Green and I welcome you to the 26th episode of my podcast Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My guest today is Professor Gregory Brown from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas and the University of Oxford. He specializes in 18th century France, and today we will be not talking so much about his research but about his academic career, and Gregory will tell us how actually he made a career in the United States, what were the options, and how he achieved his position as professor. So I welcome you to my podcast and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Gregory, and welcome to my podcast. I'm glad to have you here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Traditionally, I start my podcast with the very same question to all my guests is where do you come from? Can you tell a little bit about your family, about your parents, perhaps siblings, the environment that you grew up in?
Yeah, that's a really great question, actually, I think. I come from, the United States. I was actually born in New York City, but I grew up mostly in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and my father was a public health scientist. In that sense, I think that I am probably typical of a lot of the people who became historians in American universities of my generation. That came from public school, which for us is the accessible school system, but without a huge focus on history such as it would be taught. So that when I was in school, we studied very little history. We studied social sciences, which was much more focused on contemporary social problems. And I did not really, we took tests in history, we studied the narrative of American politics, but I didn't really study history until I went to college. I think one fact that is also, I think, noteworthy, because I ended up studying, at least in graduate school, in the field of French history. And one of the things that I always think about is of note, and I think sort of speaks to your question, is that for Americans, of the Americans who came of age in the post-war period in the 1960s, I think through the 1990s, and I kind of went to school in the 80s and to graduate school in the 90s, I think that the field of French history was very strong and very appealing, precisely because there's not a very strong sense of French ethnic identity in American culture. So I like to think this was actually a very available space wherein people could actually, as it were, explore intellectual interests that did not have to be identified with themselves and their own family and their own position in society. And I think that if we think about the discipline today, particularly as it's practiced in the United States, that space is less and less. More and more people, in effect, enter into the discipline in some way, either expected to be or expecting themselves to be related to a certain identity position that they also study. The other thing that I think is interesting and maybe speaks to the relationship between history and my formation as a historian is that I was particularly interested in French history in part because my father had served in the US military and had been stationed in Paris when it was the NATO headquarters. And I think that there was a very large, I think there were 80 to 100,000 Americans in the early 1960s who lived in France in any given year. And the total number of people whose family lives involved some period of time living in France while serving in the US military between 1945 and 1965 is quite significant. And I think that had a very significant impact on the subset of American culture that becomes historians.
I think it's interesting how you drew immediately the parallel between one's interest and one's expectation nowadays to fill a niche at the university with his or hers or theirs identity. That was not really the case for me when I was a PhD student, not when I was a regular university student. I was just fascinated with the topic of history itself. And I wonder, as a child, did you like history? Did you like any historical books? Did you watch historical movies? Did your parents take you for some trips around New York or outside? to see some things that had to do with history.
Yes, I think so, although most of it was focused on American political history. Certainly, so I grew up actually in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., which has some
Uh-huh.
of the finest museums in the United States, including the American Museum, the Museum of American History, and certainly spent time there. I think that in the 1970s, when I was sort of a child, the big exhibit at that museum, and I think the big sort of thinking about history at that time, was really social history and specifically the history of immigration. There was a very famous exhibit at the Museum of American History called A Nation of Many, I think something like this. And it was about ethnic identities and immigration, right? In the 1970s, that was a really important component of how American society thought about itself and therefore how its historians, or perhaps the other way around. And I think that in that sense, therefore, it was very interesting. And again, I would draw the parallel between that increasing focus on one's identity and background and ethnicity, and on the other hand, the way in which particularly not only French history, but the history of the Enlightenment, I think appealed to me because it was not tied to that, right? The Enlightenment, such as it was taught certainly when I was in school, you thought of it in terms of universalism. You thought of it in terms of the breadth of both human capacity, reason, and also of human experience. And in that sense, I think that was very appealing to me, the universalism of French history as it was available and of the Enlightenment.
So once you were done with school, and you mentioned that at school it was mostly political American history, why did you decide to go into history to start with? Like, why
Yeah,
not become an official like your father and go that way, or maybe do business like at least from what we hear here on the continent about the States, why not to do some business?
right. So I think that the answer is, as is the case for many people, it was a great professor. I think if I recall correctly, I started college with the intent of studying political science, took a course that, if I recall correctly, was sort of like quantitative assessment of the US presidents that made no sense to me. But I had great professors in the field of medieval and early modern European intellectual history. And that really is what drew me into the discipline and to become a major. And of course, at American universities, one of the really great things about American universities, as opposed to most of the British or continental model, is that you have the opportunity to choose your major field of study after you've begun your studies. You do general studies first. So that was certainly my case, and I ended up doing history and with a focus on intellectual history. And that, I think, had a lot to do with just the terrific lecturers and the terrific seminar leaders that I was able to study with.
Well, I think that that's actually the case for many students, and I remember myself when I was doing my bachelor study in history, and I didn't know really which period would be interesting. It was really the medieval and the early modernists that were really capturing my attention. There was something in that type of history that was not uh, simple and in a way maybe connected to some literature that I was reading as a teenager that I found interesting, all the Three Musketeers and all those famous books of Dumas. And yeah, it was not an easy choice between medieval history and early modern history. So why early modern and not medieval in your case, since both of them were appealing?
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of it, again, was the professors and the way that, so my first experience, my first courses were ancient and medieval.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that was required. I'm not sure if I'm misremembering this, but I think that says something about my personality, that I sort of looked in the catalog and said, I must start with the ancient and then the medieval and then the early modern. And by the time I got to early modern, I was studying with Alan Kors, who is well known for his work on Durbach and then later on materialism. And he was the editor of a big reference work, the Encyclopedia of the Enlightenment, which is still widely consulted because it's available online through OUP. So I really ended up studying a lot with him. I took 3 or 4 courses with him, and then ended up not doing my thesis with him, which had to, but he advised me a lot on it. I did my thesis actually, of all things, on the response to John Stuart Mill. And oddly enough, that's really when I got into the Enlightenment, because I read John Morley for the first time. And John Morley was an English late 19th century writer, editor, kind of man of letters, who wrote some of the most important works on major Enlightenment figures in English in the 1870s. And so to a certain extent, that was sort of the roundabout route. And I was always therefore, I think, very interested and remain interested in Enlightenment historiography.
You know, there is a certain stereotype that comes when European historians think about American historians, and sometimes also about English ones, is the fact that many of them perhaps don't know many languages besides English.
Yeah.
But at the same time, many of them like to study history of various European countries. And sometimes it comes to ridiculous situations where people rely only on English-speaking literature, which is not your case at all. And I would like to ask about this. Where does the French come from? Because I saw in your bibliography that you actually publish in French. Not
Yes.
only that you research French history, but also the language itself comes
Yeah,
before.
that's right. I mean, I think the premise of your question is a very important one. I think we do not study enough languages in the United States. That has gotten much, much worse since I was a student. I think that even before we get into history and historiography, there's huge negative consequences to that. And I think that, you know, the challenges of American culture in terms of American relationship to the world, I think really would be better handled if we were more consciously teaching. You know, there's many, many languages spoken in the United States. Many of them are what we call heritage languages, people who learn their language from their family. We do relatively little teaching. So when I enter, and as a result of that, I think you're right. And we see that in enrollments, even within European or world history, the ability to teach with any source material or any scholarship that's outside of English is really, really limited. So that really does change how I think we can teach and how Americans understand the world, and that's regrettable. I think that the in my case then, so there was a requirement which many graduate programs had to do languages, and you had to do 2 languages, and the recommended languages at that time, which was really based on what you would read as secondary sources, the recommended languages were French and German. And I had learned French in part because I started to study it in school, and that had directly to do with my father's Francophilia, which came from his period of living in Paris. And German I had to learn, and I actually quite struggled. I barely passed the German exam. So I learned to read it so I could read scholarly articles. I never learned to speak it, which is regrettable, particularly when I travel. But I think that the awareness of scholarship outside of English is really, really limited. And I think that is a regrettable part. One of the good things that helps mitigate that for American graduate students, in particular when they're trained, is the tendency that they will study abroad as a way to consult archives. So that's also a way to perfect or develop languages. And so for me, for instance, I continued to take courses, language acquisition courses on advanced French, even as I was a student, you know, consulting archival documents. And that, you know, is the case for most, I think, even to this day, students. But it tends to be one language because so many American graduate students, if they're not studying the US, are focusing on only one country. So they go to Germany and they learn German, and then no other languages. They go to French, and that's also sort of regrettable. I think that the you know, I think that the challenges we have in terms of the United States as a country, but especially our discipline of history, are tremendous. And so the language doesn't even get enough attention because we're so worried about other things. And that becomes an even greater problem because when we teach courses, the expectation that the course is measured, its success is measured by enrollment, also drives towards sort of monolingual teaching and readings. So it's a big problem. I was, because I had a good foundation from having studied French in school, and then when I got to study as a graduate student, and I actually continued to have excellent teachers. I was able to take a course that was like a business French course that was really taught for business people, but it taught me very good sort of polite conversational French, which was very, very helpful when you actually dealt with academics. And I think that did help a lot. It certainly helped in terms of the intellectual sociability. I developed good relationships with people who are now very, very prominent historians, within my field, when we were graduate students. And I think the language was very important in that.
Well, I think this problem is becoming more and more common also on the continent, because we see languages deteriorate at schools, and consequently our students also know less and less. There's still a possibility to learn it at the university, but I think by the time you reach university, if you don't have any basis in learning foreign languages, eventually it comes as a disadvantage, quite a big one. And you mentioned an important part of every student's life is travel. Unfortunately, not everyone is traveling, but for someone who is studying French history, traveling to France, of course, is very important. Do you remember your first visit?
Yes, absolutely. No, because my first visit was when I was a small child with my parents. I have photographs of that. My first visit as an adult was in 1989. I was a college student and I was on a summer program. And that was, of course, the summer of the bicentenary. So it was a very interesting time to be in France. It was a very interesting time to be in France and studying history. There were many, many publications around the French Revolution that came out at that time. And so it was actually really a even more central topic to the field at that time. And that was a year before I entered graduate school. So that made a big difference. And I think that the other thing that was, I think, really, that was, I think, just kind of the last moment, that period of the late 80s, early 1990s, when the daily life of French people was very significantly different from the daily life of Americans. The most noticeable thing to a young person at that time was that, the United States by this point had really kind of outlawed public smoking, whereas in France it was still very, very common. But really, in terms of coming to understand things about social history, because when I traveled and I went to towns, I had a lot of opportunities that summer, and sometimes there were family homestays. So you really got to understand a few things about urban development and about towns, because you could actually see it. You could see what a city center looked like. You could see how transportation routes developed and things like that, which you would not really be able to recognize today, right? Because your entry is generally to an airport, which is outside the city, and your travel across the city is generally in an automobile. So I think that was a good time, and I remember being aware of that when I traveled, that you would sort of find the city center, find the transportation hub, and that was a good way to explore a city or even a small town.
How did you find the French food? Which is also quite different, I think, from the American one.
Well, I think, yes. I think, as a student, you don't have much money. So I think most of the time what I remember was we ate a lot of sort of picnics of cheese and bread, which was fine, which was very good. I think that so for Americans, of course, of an earlier generation, the affordability of French food was really, really crucial. And this, of course, goes back to like the 1920s. There's a famous American writer, A.J. Liebling, who wrote about this as a young person. He was traveling in France and he could afford to eat very, very well. And so even, in the post-war years, even the 1950s, when my father was there, I remember when my father came to visit me, and these old restaurants in the 1950s that he wanted to go to, which were now very, very expensive, because when he had been there as a young man, it was quite affordable. So I don't think that was quite as much a part of the experience by the 1980s or 1990s. And of course, also, I had a really good experience as a student there because I was with so many other students. So a lot of the meals were really more about the sociability than about the food.
Which university was that? Where did you stay?
When I was a student. So I was actually, at that time, I was a student at Columbia University, which has and still has a building in the 6e arrondissement, which was and still is used for various study programs. And so that was technically the institute where I was enrolled, since I was getting credit towards my American university. And I think the big place to go for intellectual sociability at the time was the École des Hautes Études, as I think it is today. And that had in part to do with the fact that their seminars were very easily entered into. You could find the directory, this pre-internet, right? But you could find the directory, you could find the individual instructor, you could get the permission. The Sorbonne was totally opaque. You could not understand really how to find, and that of course is a function of the way in which the École was created in the 1950s to be that kind of place, with big investments from the Rockefellers, for instance, to be open and to be a kind of gathering point. And I met German students and learned a lot. Like I learned about Hellenistique as a discipline, which we don't really have, right? As a kind of, so the friends I made, the people I interacted with who were studying French history, but who were from Germany, generally when were in that field, and it brought different methodologies and different ways of thinking, which was really, really interesting.
Now I'd like to go back to the academic path itself, and I know that you actually studied in two very prestigious American universities. One of them was University of Pennsylvania for your what we would call bachelor's, and then Columbia University. So the choice of those universities, was it something that was obvious to you? Because you said you grew up in Washington. Pennsylvania is not too far away, but also not very close. Why UPenn?
Again, partly family history. One of my father's degrees had been from Penn, and so it was a place we knew about. He had studied in New York at Queens College, which is part of the City University system today. But Penn was sort of appealing also because I liked, at that point, I was very interested in cities and I wanted to be in a city, which it's in Philadelphia. That was, I think, a very appealing part of it. And it also was a larger university within that category of elite universities, which was, I think, appealing to me at the time. It to a certain extent had more resemblance to a large American public university than other Ivy League schools did, and that was very appealing too. So it was less about the field of study because I didn't know what I was going to study.
Was it difficult to get in?
Yes and no. I mean, I think, again, part of the rationale was Penn is a little bit larger undergraduate institution than some of the schools it's compared to. And so, but it was a process as it is today. Americans apply to different institutions. We don't have a concours, a standardized exam. It's a very unpredictable process. And I really didn't know whether I would get in there or other places, but that was very, very appealing to me among the options I had, again, for those reasons. I really wanted to be in a city, and I think it was appealing when I visited that it was a larger university that had both an urban environment, but also, sort of green space and opportunities for interaction. And that was very, very good. And I think that really, it paid off. What I didn't know then, but which had the most impact on me, was the quality of the history department. And that was, of course, the most significant factor for me. And then Columbia, I had decided I wanted to study kind of French Enlightenment, possibly French Revolution. And at that time, the big programs in the United States were Chicago, but Chicago did not really have anybody teaching permanently in that area. Stanford, where Keith Baker still teaches. He had recently moved there from Chicago. And I came very close to going there to study with Keith. And then really the other big place actually was NYU, New York University, because it has the Institute for French Studies. It didn't have an 18th century specialist, if I recall. But I ended up at Columbia in part because, again, the appeal of a university in an urban environment and the fact that it had a very strong history department. Its reputation, of course, had been made a generation earlier when it was really legendary in the 50s and 60s. And then it had really had a period of decline in terms of its reputation, but it had kind of come back. And so it was a very appealing place to go. And I had a great opportunity because I studied with Isser Woloch, who really was not at all an intellectual historian. But I met with him and talked about my interests, and he was very supportive of that. And he had his training was really in social history and in political history. And we talked about that, and really, I came away feeling it would be really interesting to work with him. And that turned out to be a great relationship.
Well, I think at this point of your career, you were wondering what's next. And I think that's a very important point that everyone asks himself or herself at the end of a PhD. So, what were your options?
Yeah. So at that time, the academic job market was challenging, but not like today where it's really, really difficult. So I applied for positions. I got a postdoc at George Mason University, which is a public university outside Washington, D.C., so it allowed me to return home for a year. And it was a very interesting postdoc because I was working on a French Revolution project with Jack Sensor and with Lynn Hunt. And it was a project to create what at that time seemed like the cutting edge, which was a CD-ROM. And depending on the age of your listeners, they may not even know what a CD-ROM is. But in the 1990s, this was the breakthrough technology. And so we created a publication that was sort of a multimedia textbook, initially published on CD-ROM. Very quickly, the CD-ROM became obsolete, and that content remains available online on the web. The book, the title is I forgot exactly what it's called, but it's on the George Mason University has what's called the Center for History and New Media website, and on there is the material, and I still use it to teach. So it's a combination of documents, of images, songs. We actually recorded songs from the period where we hired someone. I went to Paris, recorded with them. That was really interesting. So we built this project, and I would have loved to have stayed there, but it was a grant-funded project. And so the tenure track opportunity that came up that was really appealing was at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. University of Nevada, Las Vegas at that time was rapidly growing. This is the 1990s. The city of Las Vegas was rapidly growing. University was rapidly growing. The history department was rapidly growing. And they had someone who had taught French history and French Revolution previously, who was actually their classicist, their specialist in Roman history. And that faculty member had actually passed away. So they were getting large enough to split the position. And that tells you something a little bit about how a lot of American history departments were organized, where you had sort of the focus on American history, and then everybody else just sort of picked up the rest of the world as they could. So when I was hired, I was one of 4 who studied European history, and we had 1 Asianist. And after that, everybody was in US. And so a lot of my career there has been about trying to help broaden our department geographically, culturally, which we've done to some extent. And we have hired people in African history and Middle Eastern history, and we teach world history in Latin American history. They had 1 Latin Americanist at the time as well, and now we have 2. But I think that with 1 Asianist, it's still a challenge. And that's been sort of the tension for me, because as the university has grown, we've become more international in terms of our student body, in terms of our research portfolio, and we should have become more international in our curriculum. And I don't think we're quite there. I think we're still way too focused on the hic et nunc, the here and now.
Well, I think that we reached the point that I have to ask you a little bit also about your modern work and modern position. And maybe let's first of all start with your current research interests. Where did all this path from the French Revolution and French intellectual history lead you to?
So one of the places it led me to that I'm very interested in is the social relationship of writers to their society. And if one were to read like my earlier books, that's really the main question. I studied playwrights, and I was really interested in that question. We might think of it as the social history of ideas and really the social history of intellectuals, to use an anachronistic term for the 18th century. So one figure that I'm very interested in within that context is the writer Beaumarchais, Pierre Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. And Beaumarchais is generally known in the United States anyway as the author of the plays that led to the operas of the Barber of Seville and Marriage of Figaro. But in his time, he did many, many other things. And he was a very interesting figure who actually, I think, is misunderstood if we think about him primarily as a writer. And so I was able to work on some of his papers as part of my initial doctoral research because he was involved with other playwrights. But those papers, in large part, had been inaccessible. A large portion of his personal papers had remained with the Beaumarchais family from his death in 1799 up until literally 2023. And at that time, the family donated these papers finally to the National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale. And so since that time, I had been working with colleagues on a project to try and analyze the sort of social network based on the available correspondence, which was about 5,000 documents. No, about 5,000 references, about 3,500 documents is what was available. And I did some work on that. But when the donation was made, this really sort of changed it. So now I've been working on that a bit. It's actually a historian who is the curator who's going through and preparing these for public access. I've met with him. And so as they become available, I've been trying to track that and trying to think about what one can do. Not all the papers are yet accessible, but there is a lot there, even on topics that I had researched, which really expands our knowledge, but it also really would expand our understanding of his social network. And so I've been doing some work on that. And whether or not those letters get published as a single collection, which I am skeptical of, but there is a great interest also in the study of letters in the 18th century as correspondence networks, as documents, as rhetoric. And so particularly colleagues that I work with at Oxford and in Paris, have a lot of questions that we think we can ask of that material. So that's one area that I'm very interested in. Another area that I've been always interested in and I've been more actively researching in the last few years, as I mentioned, is the historiography of the Enlightenment. But what I'm most interested in really is the historians. And that's why I was really delighted by your invitation to speak about this, because as a person with a great interest in the social history of intellectuals, I've tried to approach the study of particularly Anglophone historians of the Enlightenment in the post-war period from that standpoint, and trying to really understand the relationship between social, political, intellectual context of the post-war years and the emergence of the study of the 18th century, and particularly of the Enlightenment within history, as a kind of distinct subdiscipline, which is what happened. So I've been looking a lot into the history of that. I did a article on very early work of Peter Gay on the Enlightenment. He was also a political scientist originally and had not actually worked on the 18th century until he started to work on Voltaire's political thought in the 1950s, mid-1950s. And I've done work on the editing of the Voltaire correspondence, which was a massive project that was completed ultimately in the 1960s, although in many ways continued because the editing of the complete works. But I believe that that's a really interesting window into a lot of important changes in the humanistic sciences and in the relationship we have as a society, as well as scholars, to writers and ideas. And the idea of Voltaire, for instance, which was very, very contested even during the Second World War. The Vichy regime sort of appropriated Voltaire as a kind of national and even anti-Semite hero for them. And so as it were, Voltaire as the hero of tolerance had been there, but it wasn't the primary thing that Voltaire was associated with. He was associated primarily with literature, with theater, with poetry. And so that idea of him as, in some ways, an intellectual of the 1950s, that idea is really interesting to me. So I've been looking at that from the standpoint of the collection of his correspondence. And that's a great, interesting story because it's a very international story. Unlike some major figures where the papers are all in one place. That was not the case for Voltaire. His papers had been scattered. There was a large portion of it that was in the Imperial Library of Catherine of Russia, because he sold his library to her at the end of his life. But they were then resold by the Soviet regime in the 1920s and 1930s. So the recollection of them was actually a really interesting, very international project of the late 1940s, 1950s that has ties to major international organizations such as UNESCO, to governments. The government of France was a significant supporter. The Swiss government was a significant supporter, and to particularly diplomats. There were major figures who were involved in helping the man who edited them, Theodore Westermann, access these documents. So he had major diplomats, including even the British foreign minister, major diplomats within the French foreign ministry, even Soviet diplomats who were helping him obtain access to these papers for the purpose of creating this correspondence. So it's a really, to me, interesting history about, among other things, information management, the ability to reproduce documents, which at that point was based on microfilm, was considered a major component of how human sciences were changing. The work of bibliographers in terms of how information was organized and accessed was a major part of what this man Westermann was interested in, and I think a major part of what historians become interested in. Whereas previously, I think generally the text was the text, the book was the book, the artifact was the artifact. And in that sense, that's the questions I'm most interested in, how that really was in some ways transformed in the 1950s.
You mentioned something in the very beginning of our conversation, which I also found very interesting, is the connection between the author and his public. And looking at your very, I would say, efficient and prominent work on Twitter, I think that you are part of this actually, because you are working in a way to establish this connection with your public. Because, of course, your name is a known name among historians, and not only. So, how do you find yourself on Twitter, and why is it important for you to voice your opinion?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was actually thinking a little bit about this morning because I thought you might ask that. I mean, for me, it has generally not been a place where I've been doing mostly talking about my own research. There are some historians who have been very, very successful at sort of using it as a medium to talk about their own work or to become public commentators based on their historical expertise. I actually got involved with it really when I was doing advocacy. For a number of years, I was the head of our faculty union in Nevada. And that was actually when I started. This was the early 2010s when Twitter was kind of new. And it was a very effective way to get information out. And it was really for political advocacy. I think once I left that and I was involved in university administration, I still was primarily using it as a way to talk about, I worked for a few years in the university administration. And then I think when I returned to the faculty and to academia, it became primarily a way to generate the kind of conversation that's really actually quite difficult in, I think, American academia generally, and particularly at a university like mine, where there's not a lot of people interested in world affairs, interested in, they're interested, but they're not interested in it as a form of dialogue. So it became a way to do that. And so I think I would say, you know, American politics and world affairs has been my primary kind of area of interest, but because of particularly the transformations of that particular platform in the last few years, I've really sort of focused it primarily on as a way to get access to information that's otherwise not available. References to scholarly works, references to works I can use in my teaching because I teach world history. And over the last year, particularly debates about, but especially access to information about Israel. So in the United States, of course, our news media is relatively limited in its reach for world affairs to begin with. And I think that it, for me, became very, very important because there was access to good reporting, as well as to major figures involved in really interpreting and understanding, which was very, very important, I think, because so much of the conversation in the United States had really been very, very narrowly focused in response to some really sort of narrow activist groups that were not interested. So that's been very, very important for me. And I've discovered a lot of scholarship. I've discovered a lot of other scholars And it's also been a way to sometimes vent when there are, sort of as emotionally charged developments. I think that I don't really know, frankly, if that will continue. I mean, the medium has become, because of the removal of all the moderation, and I think because of the awareness that everyone has that there are significant investments by certain actors on the global stage to try and influence the content. I'm not sure whether it will survive. I mean, I guess I've been joking for 2 years, and I'm kind of sticking around to be there when it collapses. But I think that social media is very, very important for historians. A lot of the information that comes to our students, even our very best students, comes to them first through social media. I can even speak about, some of my own best students, and not everything that is recorded in video format is terrible, right? And I think the availability of, for instance, academically oriented podcasts is a tremendously valuable resource. And I think that it's really a valuable thing for particularly younger historians to develop the skills to be able to produce that kind of media.
I think that you're absolutely right about Twitter, and for me, it was a platform where actually I did the complete opposite of what you were doing. I was not interested in news or any political events, but mostly promoting my own work. And I must say that I was rather successful because I had a lot of very useful connections that materialized in all kind of projects. But over the past 2 years, I became much more active in trying to do, of course, on a much smaller scale than what you do. Just try to bring some of the verified and maybe more precise information on certain things that pertain to our world and to the Middle East. And maybe last question on the topic is how do you deal with the wave of hate that you encounter there?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that in many ways, the preoccupying story, the preoccupying question in American higher education, for the past year has been around campus anti-Semitism. And it's really varied. One of the things I remind everybody when we start talking about this is that American universities or American higher education is much broader than just the elite institutions that get most of the attention. So 2/3 of American college students are at institutions that are either two-year colleges, which generally have a more vocational orientation, or at regional public institutions, which tend to not be residential. You don't have students living on campus that can do things like live in a tent for a week as a political statement. So I think that there has been a little bit too much attention paid, frankly, but it has also been very galvanizing, I think, for two categories of, I think, American academics that have the Jewish identity. One would be, I think, for people who are generally in institutions. And so, as is the case in most of world history, the Jewish population tends to be focused in urban areas. And the difference in institutions between the presence of a sizable Jewish community and a very small one is quite significant. They tend to be grouped into those two categories. So there's been two very, very different experiences. The people that feel that they're the only Jewish person in their faculty have generally always been more or less, as it were, isolated, very rarely manifesting a Jewish identity. And then at the other end of it, people very, very deeply involved in this sort of intense debates around Judaism, around Israel and Zionism for a long time, right? And so I think that for people outside of that, on the one hand, they are discovering that there are many people in the higher levels of American society who are Jewish, who feel that they've had to hide their identity for a long time. That's the people that tend to be at the smaller institutions. And then at the higher institutions, they're discovering that actually not all Jews think alike, that not all Zionists are of a like mind either. The use of Zionist in the singular is one of the great paradoxes of the contemporary debate. There's almost no such moment where you can do that unless you look at only one institution, which is, in my view, the worst way to do intellectual history, right? But if you were to do the history of socialism and you just looked at the SPD at one moment, you would not be doing the history of socialism. The thing that has been most important, and this has been something that's been a really important part of my life for the last year, is the opportunity to actually build structures around the Jewish community within the university and from the university to the community. So I live in a city that has a pretty sizable Jewish community, but has a very limited Jewish presence on our campus. And that's in part because most Jewish families' kids go to other cities for their higher education. We have had a presence. It's just been relatively small. And I think that that was something that largely by the leadership of the students, and particularly our very small but really, really amazing contingent of Israeli American students. And I think that that became very galvanizing because of the fact that there was this sort of concerted effort by activist groups that were sort of national to identify campuses where they felt they could mobilize students on a certain point of view, especially on campuses where there were not a lot of people who were knowledgeable about the region. And that was, I think, what some of these national organizations tried. So we had a period of time where there were a series of rallies and protests, many of whose participants were not students. The students who were involved were actually very interested to learn more. They did not come in with a great deal of knowledge. And, you know, I think that the future, though, is of concern insofar as there has been a kind of exploitation of some of the things we were talking about earlier, of the limited geographic and global horizons of American higher education. There's just not that many people who really know the history of the Ottoman Empire, for instance, and therefore don't really know anything other than what the activist narrative presents, which is always a simplistic narrative. And I think that the second thing is that for campuses which have had, it's actually been more pronounced actually on the campuses which have had a prominent Jewish community, because they can, to a certain extent, those institutions, whether it's Hillel, which is the major Jewish student union, or even just individual Jewish faculty or Jewish administrators, sort of be identified as very, very powerful. So if the argument that one wants to make as an activist, which some groups do, that the real story here is the unaccounted sort of power of Israel or of the Jews, which has a long history in Western culture, it's relatively easy for them to point at these large organizations and say, see how powerful and influential they are. We are somehow fighting against this power. Our institution, since we didn't have that perhaps, didn't really have that. So there was nobody to really point to for these groups as a villain on campus. And as a result of that, I think that the moment where there was more heat than light passed, and this academic year, we've had a tremendous amount of really interesting things going on in terms of speakers, in terms of working towards curricular changes that will both broaden the historical offerings and the literary offerings, and also working with national organizations on trying to help raise awareness and education around Jewish identity and Jewish inclusion. And of course, at this moment in American history, when those efforts towards inclusion and identity, which have been such an important part of higher education for the past generation, are now sort of in question. There's a lot of confusion. And so there is a way in which I think history is particularly a valuable position from which to try and do this, because one can speak more broadly, that it's not one group against another, one interest group against another, one identity trying to gain greater prominence within a larger portfolio of diversity, but rather to talk about the actual interactions, migrations. Not every migration is a colonization, is one of the major themes that I try and develop when I teach world history. To talk about the fact that nation states are a very new and modern development. And that seems to be surprising to a lot of people. So they say, the formation of the state of Israel in 1948, that's not anomalous. It's not anomalous at all. Most nation states that exist in the world today were formed in the immediate post-war years through decolonization. But also the fact that the population of that country in particular, for important historical reasons, is the result of so many migrations dating back really to the end of the Bronze Age. And I think that it becomes an opportunity to try and get students not to change their mind and feel one way or another, but to have them open their mind and maybe ask new questions that are not just about whose land is it, right? If we think about history in general, not just that question, if we ask whose land is it, we really miss a point. So I'll return, and I know we're running out of time, to say the French Revolution. And you can look at the French Revolution and say, wow, is that in fact an anti-colonial revolution? There's a great article by the historian Pierre Sernat that argues that. And he says, look, if you look at the narrative of French history, the nobility is understood. This isn't necessarily the actual narrative, but this is how French schools taught French history, which was this famous line from the famous textbook by Lévis, nos ancêtres les Gaulois, right? That our people were the Gauls, and who comes in? The Franks. The Franks then occupy and become the landowners and the nobles, and then the revolution is a revolt against them. That narrative worked particularly well in France between 1870 and 1940, right? And the idea that this was actually an anti-colonial uprising by the indigenous people is one way to interpret that. It's a ridiculous way to interpret it as history. But if we think about why did people like that narrative? Why did it work in textbooks and schools? And what are the problems with it? I think we open up a lot of opportunities to get people to think more broadly about peoplehood in general, about nations in general, and fundamentally, the thing that I think history is most valuable for, which is empathy, does actually become possible.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and also especially for the last part of it, because I find your point of view on history and current events, or the interpretation of current events, very enlightening. And I hope that more people will follow your example in the academia. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's a great pleasure to chat with you.